Karel Appel made his international breakthrough from Paris, and in that period where the art center moved from Paris to New York. And this show here shows very much the impact that his first longer sojourn in New York had on his work. He met some of his colleagues, New York school artists, in particular Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein. He saw these incredible formats, and he saw also a way of painting that was later called action painting. I like to think that it's very spontaneous, very direct, sort of to circumvent too much thinking in trying to get to the roots, to the basics, to the very primitive layers of humanity. Yeah? That was basically something that was triggering all the avant-gardes after the war on both sides of the Atlantic. And Karel Appel had inspirations from both sides. Huh? He started in Paris. He went to Paris in 1950 already. That was the place to be. He became famous. No, not famous. It was not yet at that time. He's very much today identified with CoBrA. But CoBrA dissolved already in 1951. Interesting detail, the lingua franca of the CoBrA group, which were artists from Netherlands, from Belgium, from Denmark, foreigners, was French, not English. And then he joined a group, kind of a cloud of international artists around a French critic, Michel Tapier. Michel Tapier had very early on contacts with the United States. He introduced Karel Appel to his New York gallerist, Martha Jackson, already in 1953, 1954, and in 1954, in autumn, he had his first show in New York. And the works that you see here, at least it's basically the anchor of the show, is the kind of work that he made when he came back from New York, from his first visit to New York. And the strange thing that you can see is there are two branches, you would say, which intermingle also a bit, which on face value would seem to be contradictory, because you have abstract painting, action painting, the very raw action of the artist, which of course was against academicism, against convention, against the conventional idea of painting. It was an action. And then you have the most academic subject that you could imagine, the nude. And these were happening next to each other. In the 50s, abstraction was almost dogmatic, an orthodoxy. Everyone who wanted to be modern had to be abstract, because that was the expression of freedom after the war. And it was the free world as opposed to totalitarian world where you had socialist realism or fascist realism. So freedom was abstraction. But the CoBrA people, they were somewhere in between from the beginning. That was a kind of a very strange, separate position. In the painting that you see behind me, you see also there's a kind of intermingling between both, the free line, but also still the nude subject. These were things that he brought back from New York. I mean, action painting is obvious, but Willem de Kooning, his compatriot, you would say, who moved to the United States already in the 20s, he's famous for his nudes. And so there's these two things that probably inspired him most from his first visit to the United States. There's one of those nudes that was painting at the same time, which is now in the collection of the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, a portrait like this of Machteld. Machteld was a fashion model, Balenciaga in Paris, and so he had, through her, access to a lot of beautiful women, and that probably triggered the link with de Kooning, and that was actually the first time that he systematically painted a whole series of nudes, which are all these nudes on a white background, very expressionist, sometimes more, sometimes less realistic, different formats as well. So it's a whole group of paintings. And as I said, you would on face value you think that's the opposite of abstract painting, but it's also, in a sense, the opposite of CoBrA. CoBrA was deliberately choosing the primitive, the primary, the basics, children drawings, mental ill drawings. So silver lines going through the whole work. You're also referring to that, the freedom, the issue of freedom in the work, the being free of conventions, free of prescribed notions what art should be, being without any, like the innocent eye, Ruskin's innocent eye, let's say, that is the ideal that he was striving for. But the difficulty with that, and he was very aware of that very early on already, aware of that, if you let everything go, every orientation line or something, every reference, it becomes very quickly mechanic and repetitive. A kind of an automatism, and that he didn't want that. And when he realized that he became too familiar with some certain way of painting, he was searching for a confrontation with something which was unknown to him. He did paintings black on black, white on black, and he did also at some point black on white. That is like taking out one element to concentrate on what remains. The primacy of matter is something that was very much in the center of his interest in the 1950s, in Paris particularly. You think of the matter paintings by Dubuffet, Fautrier, Anthony Tapies, the painters who work not only with paint but with kind of dust and wood particles on the canvas to make it thicker, to make the paint, the body sitting on the canvas. So that was something that he really went very thoroughly into in the 1950s as the first step to get away from CoBrA. It was really part of the new École de Paris. And he came back to that later on many times. As I just said, the paintings of the 90s, you almost isolate paint as a matter, as a big body. And he also conceptualized about matter. He was fighting against the matter, he said at some point. There is a very interesting interpretation by Levi-Strauss of the way of the creating, and he mentioned this concept of the resistance of matter. The resistance of matter is something that you start with something, you have an object or paint or whatever, and you have an idea maybe, and then you start and it looks different. So you change your idea. It's a kind of a dialogue going on. That's the resistance of the matter. And then when he becomes almost, you quoted these phrases, do not paint, I hit, is almost like violence. This is, of course, particularly when he was young, there was a lot of resistance from his Dutch environment. There was a lot of scandal, what he was doing, and so one of the reasons why he moved to Paris was he was fed up with that. And that was fighting against conventions, fighting against the bourgeois expectation from an artist, and so these are all layers of this almost violent talk as a youthful, spontaneous reaction to reality. But there is another silver line going through his thematic oeuvre, which is he was always very, very concerned by the relation between man and nature. In his own living, in his own body, and also in relation to landscape. And that's why, for instance, you have this theme that also one of the paintings in the show initiates, figure, landscape, or paysage, visage, which later on in the 70s he took up again in a whole series. And again in the 90s it came back. It's always this kind of, what is the place of human being in nature, and how man tends, the modern Western man tends to destroy nature, and he can only live with it. He's not independent of it. Yes, he was actually the first high point, pinnacle of his career. He was very famous. 1964, we're talking about, more than half a century ago. He was invited at the Venice Biennale, he was invited at the Documenta. The Venice Biennale, by the way, was the famous Venice Biennale where Robert Rauschenberg got his prize, the Venice Biennale prize, and that was perceived in Paris as a bomb, as now it's finished, now it's in New York, the center of the art world. He was invited at the Documenta, and the paintings that were selected didn't arrive. They were blocked at customs. And so he waited until the eve before the opening and said, no, just put me some panels on the wall, and he painted it in one night. And that is really, must have been some instance of an action painting, because it was very quick, it's huge, and it's also very physical. It's really direct relation, body painting. And that is quite spectacular. This painting was never shown since. It's here the first time that it's shown in this long time. And also he had done, meanwhile, murals also commissioned for the Stedelijk Museum. You have this big one, which was the former canteen in the Stedelijk Museum, which is now the entrance hall. And then you have the Appel Bar, which is in the back, these were all commissioned at the time of Willem Sandberg's directorship. Then you have a work which I very much link also to the Documenta work, which was actually painted just when he came back from this first sojourn in New York, the UNESCO headquarters. UNESCO headquarters were inaugurated in '59, and as always with big construction commissions, there is a percentage for art. And Karel Appel was invited to participate. I think 10 artists were in it, and there were some of them which are really from the classical avant-garde, like Picasso, Hans Arp. There were some of the big names, which were already big names, and Karel Appel was a young guy.